friends, this is Miss Angie. I'm here to read a story to you from the book The Complete Fairy Tales and Stories of Hans Christian Andersen. Today's story is called What Happened to the Thistle. Adjoining the rich estate was a lovely and beautifully kept garden of rare trees and flowers. Guests at the estate enjoyed this fine garden and praised it. People from the countryside all about, and townspeople as well, would come every Sunday and holiday to ask if they might see the garden. Even whole schools made excursions of it. Just outside the fence that separated the garden from the country lane, there grew a very large thistle, which is a big plant. It was so unusually big, with such vigorous, full-foliaged branches rising from the root, that it was well deserved to be called a thistle bush. No one paid any attention to her except one old donkey that pulled up the dairymaid's cart. He would stretch out his old neck towards the thistle and say, "You're a beauty. I'd like to eat you." But his tether was not long enough. What was holding him back, his tether was not long enough to let him reach the thistle and eat her. There was a big party at the manor house. Among the guests were fine aristocratic relations from the capital, charming young girls, and among them was a young lady who had come from a foreign land, all the way from Scotland. Her family was old and noble and rich in the land and gold. She was a bride well worth winning, though more than one young man and their mothers thought so too. The young people amused themselves on the lawn where they played croquet. They strolled about in the gardens. Each young lady plucked a flower and put it in a young man's buttonhole. The young lady from Scotland looked all around for her flower, but none of them suited her until she happened to look over the fence and saw the big, flourishing thistle bush, a full, deep purple with healthy-looking flowers. When she saw them, she smiled, and she asked the young heir of the household to pick one of them for her. "That is Scotland's flower," she said. "It blooms on my country's coat of arms, and that's the flower for me." She plucked the flower from the thistle, and he pricked his finger in the process as much as if he had torn the blossom from the thorniest rose bush. When she put it into his buttonhole, he considered it a great honor, for every other young man would have gladly given his lovely garden flower for any blossom from the slender fingers of the girl from Scotland. If the heir of the household felt himself highly honored, how much more so the thistle? She felt as full as if the sunshine and dew went right through her. "I must be more important than I thought," she said to herself. "I really belong inside, not outside near this fence. One gets misplaced in the world, but I now have one of my offspring not only over the fence, but actually in a buttonhole." To every one of her buds that bloomed, the thistle bush told what had happened. Not many days went by before she heard the important news. She heard it not from passers-by, nor from the chirping little birds, but from the air itself, which collects sound and carries them far and wide. From the shadiest walks of the garden, from the furthest rooms of the manor, where the doors stood ajar and the windows were left open. She heard that the young man who got the thistle flower from the slender fingers of the girl from Scotland now had won her heart and hand. They made a fine couple. It was such a good match. "I brought that about," the thistle believed, thinking of how her flower had been chosen for the gentleman's buttonhole. Each new bud that opened was told of this wonderful happening. "Undoubtedly, I shall now be transplanted into the garden," thought the thistle. "Perhaps they will even pinch me into a flower pot, which is the highest honor of all." She thought about this so long and at length that she was full and firm with conviction. "I am to be planted in a flower pot." Every little thistle bud which opened was promised that it too would be put in a pot, perhaps even a buttonhole. That would be the highest honor they could hope to go. But not one of them reached a flower pot, much less a buttonhole. They lived upon light and air. By the day they drank the sunshine, and by night they drank the dew, and were visited by bees and wasps, who came in search of a dowry of honey, of the flower. They took away the honey, but left the flowers behind. Such a gang of robbers, said the Thistle Bush. I'd like to stick a thorn through them, but I can't. Her flowers faded and fell away, but new ones came in their place. You have come as if you were called for, the Thistle Bush told them. I expect to cross the fence here any minute. A couple of innocent daisies and some tall, narrow-leaved canary grass listened with deep admiration. They believed everything that they heard. The old donkey who had pulled the milk cart looked longingly at the blooming thistle bush and reached out for it, but again, his tether was too short. The thistle thought so hard and so long about the Scotch Thistle, whom she considered akin to her, that she began to believe that she herself had come from Scotland and that she was her own ancestor who had grown up in the Scottish Arms. It was top lofty to think, but then the tall thistle are apt to think tall thoughts. Sometimes one is of more illustrious ancestry than he ventures to suppose, said a nettle which grew nearby. It had a notion that it could be transformed into fine muslin if properly handled. Summer went by and fall went by, and the leaves fell from the trees. The flowers were more colorful but less fragrant. On the other side of the fence, the gardener's boy sang, Up the hill and down the hill, that's the way the world goes still. And the young fir trees in the woods began to look forward to Christmas, though Christmas was a long time off. Here I shall stay, said the thistle, as it is as if nobody thinks of me anymore. Yet it was I who made the match. They were engaged, and now they have been married, and that was 8 days ago. But I haven't progressed a single step. How can I? Several weeks went by. The thistle had one last lonely flower. Large and full it grew near the root. The cold wind blew over it. Its color faded, its splendor departed. Only the thistle-shaped cup remained, as large as an artichoke blossom and as silvery as a sunflower. The young couple, who were now man and wife, came down the garden walk along the fence. The bride looked over the fence and said, Why, there still stands that big thistle, but it hasn't a flower left. Yes, there's the ghost of one, the very last one, her husband pointed to a silvery shell of the flower. A flower itself. Isn't it lovely, she said. We must have one just like that carved around the frame of our picture. Once again, the young man had to climb the fence and pluck the silvery shell of the thistle flower. It pricked his fingers well, but he had called it a ghost. Then it was brought to the garden, to the mansion, and to the parlor. There hung a large painting, the newly married couple. In the groom's buttonhole, a thistle was painted. They spoke of that thistle flower, and they spoke of the thistle shell, the last silvered shining flower of the thistle which they had brought in with them, which was to be copied in the carving of the frame. The air carried their words about far and wide. What strange things can happen to one, said the thistle. My oldest child was put in a buttonhole, and my youngest in a picture frame. I wonder where I should go. The old donkey by the roadside looked long and lovingly at the thistle. Come to me, my sweet, he said. I cannot come to you because my tether is not long enough. But the thistle did not answer. She grew more and more thoughtful. And she thought right up to Christmas time, when this flower came of all her thinking. When one's children are safe inside, a mother may be content to stand outside the fence. It's the most honorable thought, said the sunbeam. You too shall also have a good place. In a flower pot or in a frame, the thistle asked. In a fairy tale, said the sunbeam. Here it is. The end. I hope you enjoyed. Come back next time for more stories. Bye, friends.